Greg Elbow from the Center for Social Justice and Socialist Project, who are sponsoring this afternoon's talk, along with the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. We've been organizing a number of talks over the winter and into the spring, dealing with issues related to ecology, eco-socialism, and so forth. Today's talk is on green jobs, the newest challenge for workers and unions, deals with some of the most important issues related to work. Today's talk is held, of course, at Beit Zitoun. Beit Zitoun has been a center for Canadian-Palestinian solidarity work. They have a range of books and olive oil and other things that they do here. They've often hold art exhibits. It's been a great community resource and meeting place. Similarly, Toronto has, of course, been an historical meeting place of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and particularly Ontario, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and of course this remains contested territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit, and we should acknowledge that issue, and particularly the important struggles of decolonization that remain in Canada related to that. When we're looking at questions of ecology, it's difficult not to connect it to the larger question of ecologically responsible production, the kind of central source of problems of ecological destruction, greenhouse gases, and so on. And it's then impossible not to raise questions about ecologically responsible production and leave work to the side. Leave work, and then it raises issues of the quality of the work, the shift of work, workers' rights, the collective rights over the economy. So as soon as we pose ecology questions, there are these fundamental issues about work that are raised. If we just think of one of the foremost issues in Canada is that many of us have been engaged in different ways of trying to cut back or shut down tar sands production. This raises and build towards an energy transition to address greenhouse gases. This immediately raises a lot of issues about not just the energy transition, but the transition occurring in workplaces. The retraining of the workers in those sectors, income support, the retraining and training that's needed for alternative energy production, and so forth. So these are important issues that have often been discussed in terms of a just transition, meaning what rights should be tagged to work and income support for workers as we move to a low-carbon economy. It's a struggle to get these issues into our unions, in our communities, in public policy. So it raises very important issues. But I think this question also links to a range of historical demands that have been put forward by the broad left related to the economy. Because in a sense, many of these demands from the broad left have also been greenhouse gas reduction strategies, and also have been strategies that kind of point you in the direction of alternative, ecologically responsible production. Some of these things are things like work time reduction and the sharing out of work, the radical expansion of free public services for health, leisure, parks, museum, the transformed consumption and therefore also production, issues related to public transit, the extension of the caring sector, the movement and the dismantling of military production, and so on. So when we think about these issues of ecologically responsible production, it immediately raises a whole host of historical demands that the left has put forward about the economy and ecology, and specific issues related to what do we do right now to facilitate and strengthen workplace rights over the transition to more low carbon production, but also the way that we have to conceive and think about green jobs as a whole. We have today an incredibly good panel to discuss these things, since they've all been central to many of these issues. Steve Tufts is going to kick us off, who's been working for over a number of years on labor union strategies at the local level, and over the last number of years also related to green work issues in the hospitality and service sector, and has been studying a lot of the wider issues about the just transition as well in the union movement. He'll kick us off.
Greg, thanks especially to everyone who could come this afternoon. I thought I'd start off my remarks by just going a little bit back in time to see how far we've actually come in putting these issues together. As an undergraduate studying geography at McGill University in the early 1990s, I was actually debating with colleagues, other students, who consider themselves environmental activists, the merits of tree spiking. Now, for those of you who don't know what tree spiking is, it's one way of stopping clear-cut operations in forests by taking a spike and putting it into the trunk of a tree. It doesn't really harm the tree that much, especially if it's an old-growth forest redwood. But however, if a clear-cut operation is using large capital-invested saws to harvest the forest, it actually does tremendous damage to the saws. The other part of that, however, is that it's not owners of forest companies who are operating those saws. It's actually workers. And there's actually a great deal of risk in the forest if those saw bands break and they fly off and can really hurt a worker. So that was, and the fact that some people in the environmental movement thought that was just propaganda or not worth worrying about, I think shows the divide. Jump forward about 8 years, just as I moved to Toronto to start my graduate program, and I was doing some work with the United HERE, well, it was back then just HERE, and I was put on a panel put on by the City of Toronto. It's a large conference. It was called Moving Toronto. It was about environmental movements. And on the panel was myself, Sam Ginden, Dave Kidd, and Eric Mann was up from the Bus Riders Union in LA. So I was a little bit in awe of this panel, a little bit nervous. And my presentation at that panel at the time was just to make a couple of points about the limits of some of the campaigns going on in hotels, not to have your sheets laundered every night, and the contradictions of that. Hope to come back to that campaign in a minute. And also about the need for public bus transit passes for hotel workers, because Local 75 was just starting to think about this. And I was rudely interrupted by a bike activist in the crowd at the time who said, you're really getting off target. Buses are also polluters. You have to start talking to your workers about how they need to bike to work. And I was nervous again and very polite and said, you know, these are women of different ages. They live commuting alone by bus is 2 hours. From Mississauga to downtown is a heck of a bike ride, especially after you've cleaned 16 rooms in a hotel. But this person wasn't moving. The person just went on to then attack Eric Mann and said that the Bus Riders Union was a farce. They should have fought for trains all along, and the bus lanes were a distraction. And it sort of indicated to me how this divide was still lead to go. At the end, Eric Mann was very nice. You could tell he was nervous at the beginning of the talk and whispered in my ear, you handled that guy quite well, but you should have told him to go fuck himself.
True Eric Mann.
True Eric Mann. But I think it shows the divide that even between green and blue, so-called, that has persisted up until the late 1990s, and I still think persists today, even though there has been some headways. So this remarks come from some work I've done at York University with a larger project called Work in the Warming World. There's a book coming out this year with this title, and some of the remarks I make and ideas are going to be in a chapter in that edit collection. The collection's put together by Carl Lipsig Mummy and Steve McBride. But I'll just try to sum up my comments in 4 quick points and maybe end with a little bit of a case study that I mentioned too about whether or not you get your sheets laundered and the contradictions of that. The first, though, I think one thing we've really come to terms with is that the greening and fighting climate change and environmental causes is not only about consumption, that it's about consumption and production. That's what has to be addressed. We're not going to address climate change by changing our consumption patterns in a capitalist or post-capitalist society and production system. questions of production and the distribution of goods must remain pivotal, not just producing them, but how we get them from point A to point B. However, not to seriously address consumption and only address production is also problematic, because it is going to have to take both of them at the same time. What we produce and what we need to produce to consume has to be considered. So that's, I think, one thing. We're shifting our attention away from a politics of production to a politics of production, not just a politics of green consumption. Second, and this is a little bit controversial, I don't mean to put any of my other panelists on the spot, but I'll clarify my remarks. There's no such thing as a green job. There simply is no such thing. There's too many contradictions, and I think we all can think about them. You can be an environmental lawyer fighting for carbon tariffs or whatever the environmental cause is, but if you're jet setting around the world, you have quite a big carbon footprint with all the emissions from the planes you're doing. There's just these contradictions completely come up. We can talk about solar panels and the installation of solar panels. Big example, solar panels, the batteries that contain cadmium, one of the most carcinogenic toxins on the planet. And they're often shipped to less developed economies to dismantle and do the waste disposal of. So it's all kinds of contradictions. Where we're at this juncture, and with climate change especially so serious, we have to talk about the greening of work, of all work. And that's, I think, what the project at York is trying to emphasize. That you really have to attack every part of the commodity chain and green the labor process throughout if we're going to have any impact on reducing emissions for the long term. And I think that's where I come at, is that all work needs to be green. We just can't talk about a transition to green jobs. And however, there are difficult questions with that I'll get to in a minute. My third point, and again, some people have challenged me on this before, and I expect to be challenged again. The greening of work is not simply the part of a left strategy. The greening of work can be part of a right capital strategy as well. My argument here is that nature and the ecology can exert sovereignty over both capital and labor. What we see now is labor, capital, ecology, or nature is involved in a trialectic relationship. That both are being negotiated at the same time, and at times ecology can operate power and sovereignty over capital and over labor, and vice versa. All three are in tension together. And, there's some historical precedents for this as well. Adolf Hitler was really big for establishing protected areas and reserves. There's been books written about ecofascism and how you use the environment as a means of the state to show an idea of authenticity or purity. So these things have to be kept into play. Of course, we have questions of neo-Malthusianism, questions of who is worthy of clean air, who is worthy of clean water, who has the right to life in a biosphere. And some of these are some of a dangerous outgrowth, I think, of a green populism as well among the right. And it's also about disciplining consumptive bodies, bodies that consume, and productive bodies, bodies that work. And I think that the greening of work, I'm going to give some examples, can be used to discipline labor. Okay. And that's something that I want to bring to our attention, what I've been studying. And the movement to services is one example. It's often implicated as green work because you're not in a factory or a coal plant. However, services also consume both labor and energy capital and fuel, and we need to clarify this as well. Now, how I conceptualize this trialectic and this tension is I put it into a form of a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, where you have capital management and working class and labor unions, and you have forms of what I call capital sovereignty and nature or ecological sovereignty. And when capital and management have power and capital trumps nature, you get management greenwashing. That's the best you can hope for. And we all have all kinds of examples of greenwashing today, where there's very little ecological benefit to what's claimed to be a panacea and largely to get people to feel good about consuming certain products. Now here's the kicker. You can also have union greenwashing as well. And I do believe that are examples of labor unions who participate in greenwashing. And I don't mean to pick on any particular union, but Herman's here, so I'll talk about Unifor. And I've been at meetings where the old CAW or Unifor activists have actually publicly claimed that crossover vehicles are the next generation of green cars. Crossover vehicles. And not hybrids, not small cars, not e-cars, crossover sport utility vehicles that are simply made with lighter weight materials. Well, that's not necessarily going to green the economy by producing more of those, but as you know, Unifor was just as dependent on those high value added vehicles as the car manufacturers themselves. So that's one example. Then we get, I think, and this is where I differ a little bit from others as well, I do believe that capital, in the final instance, contradicts with nature so much that nature will destroy capitalism, in the final instance. It doesn't mean that along the way, capitalism cannot adapt and mitigate environmental change in ways that make people's lives a lot more miserable before we get to that point of collapse. And here I talk about eco-capitalism, which involves concrete mitigation, does invite the state in to regulate things like production and emissions, but it's also quite clear on willingness to use the greening of the economy, the greening of work to displace labor and discipline labor. I'm going to get to an example of that in a minute. And of course we talk about green capitalism as a way of actually profiting from rationing and monopoly pricing as well. So these are versions as well. What I think we have to work towards is my final part of the matrix, where ecology exercises some sovereignty and labor exercises some power, and I call this labor environmentalism. It's not eco-socialism. All four scenarios I'm talking about are within capitalism. Okay? But I do think within capitalism, we can push unions further towards what I call labor and environmentalism, and that has 5 characteristics that I'd like to think we need to work towards. One is it has to include just transition from workers. If workers are displaced because democratically we decide something can't be produced anymore, they have to be cared for through new training initiatives or some kind of compensation. 2, it has to be coalition building and community based. It can't just be labor itself. It has to be the building of coalitions with marginalized groups, community groups, and not simply labor management capital. I'm not emphasizing that. 2 is that a part of this labor environmentalism emphasizes that labor can be substituted for capital in the production process. In other words, things can be made more labor intensive. We can increase the services to people and the human contact of work, not simply have processes automated. Again, deeper coalitions with community-based groups. And also, last but not least, of course, I do believe there's a role for a very interventionist state in this process. So that's just very quickly what I'm getting at, what I mean by a labor environmentalism. And that's partly because I don't believe that we are in a position where we can simply now reject all reformism out of hand and wait for a more revolutionary system to take place. I think this is something that can be done and has to be fought for in the current juncture. Now, I'd like to illuminate this with a little bit of the work I've been doing with hotel workers and about greenwashing, not only their own greenwashing, but management greenwashing as well. And an interesting case, which I mentioned before, about laundering sheets. The term greenwashing itself is actually traced back to Jay Westervelt, who was an environmentalist in the late 1980s, who got really pissed off when he got a flyer on his hotel room door that said, "Please don't launder your sheets. It's really good for the environment. You'll save energy." And he thought about it for a minute. He was a very well-seasoned environmental activist. He said, "This is going to do nothing for the environment. It's marginal at best if you don't wash your sheets one night." And he actually coined the term right then and there, greenwashing. So it's from that case where we get where the lineage of that term is sort of traced to, where it was innovated. Now, again, I talked about the dangers of this, and I was replacing laundry work, which was being contracted out in hotels in the late 1990s. But it's only been for a couple of years that the hotel sector has started to monetize this program. So you have Sheraton, and some of the big hotels have what's called it's called Make a Green Choice program. And it's not simply don't choose to launder your sheets. Hotels have been not laundering sheets if you stay in the same hotel for more than 2 nights for years. That's old hat. They're actually saying, don't have your room cleaned. Don't have your room cleaned. If you choose not to have your room serviced, we'll give you a $5 rebate. And that's the campaign. Now, a room night at Sheraton in the summer goes around for about $350, so you're not saving a whole lot of money. But what the hotels are saving is the primary variable cost of the hotel experience, which is cleaning the room. That's the most labor-intensive part of the product. And they're trying to get rid of it by appealing to a green sensibility of consumers. And of course, the unions have fought back at this and this type of greenwashing and have major campaigns about it and continue to fight with it. They're trying to get language to protect it in the collective agreements. But it's something that's actually taking place, and it's changing work and reducing the amount of hours and work for hotel room attendants in the sector. So it's something that's a contradiction. So there have been some other innovations for pushback, which I think hotels have come up with, and some of them I want to talk about and critique as well. One is it's mimicked in Australia, where I actually looked at. It's called the First Star program, which is by, it's now called the United Voice as the union. It used to be called the Liquor, Hospitality, Miscellaneous Workers Union, the worst union name in the history of Anglo-American world, LHMU. And they're now called United Voice. And they started to shift towards, in a weakened position, what's called a positive boycott, which is you don't boycott hotels when they do something bad. You actually give them a union stamp and put a seal on them, which they called the First Star program, on hotels that actually did practice good labor standards and environmental standards. And some of the criteria, there's a long list of criteria to get the award, and involve neutrality in organizing drives, meeting some environmental standards, not necessarily not having the room clean being one of them. So they tried to intervene in this process. And it worked to a little extent. It got some press, but there was limits to it. The positive boycott, and positive boycotts in the hotel sector are exploding across in Ireland, in the UK, in general, in Australia. They're being played with in North America. You can get an app on your phone which tells you which hotel to go to. It's a friendly union hotel, which one to avoid. The problem with that for unions is that you are in an adversarial relationship with the employer. And you cannot give a union seal to an employer 1 month and then the next month go into collective bargaining, where you may have to have a work stoppage. So this is the limits of what I think is happening with positive boycotts, bringing in environmental criteria in the hotel sector and in other sectors as well. So I just wanted to raise that as an issue when you see it. But there is another campaign that United HERE was playing with. It's going to hit Toronto very soon, usually around university sector and food services. However, in the US, it's really based around airports. And this is called the Real Foods, Real Jobs campaign, which is actually a campaign that has 3 things, which is good quality food, locally sourced, green food, high labor standards, but high value added in the food as well. So it's ideas about actually not using processed food in the airports, but doing everything on site, and of course charging more for it too, because it's more expensive and higher quality. And they're trying to bring that campaign into institutional food services in Toronto, specifically university settings, also some hospitals. Now there's some contradictions with this campaign as well. One is that when I asked the union about this, there is actually no transition plan for workers who are unionized, by the way, in the processing plants that are producing the ready-made foods for airports and institutional food services right now. It's not even on the radar. So that transition is not there yet. Second thing is that there's some, I'll come out of put myself out there right now. I'm not a localist. I'm an internationalist. I think there's some real issues with rudimentary localism. There's also some questions, I think, about the way that the campaign constructs localism and what is local. There's contradictions of that as well. But there is some headway being made. Now, I think this Real Foods campaign from United HRE is much more towards a labor environmentalism than anything they've done so far. However, it's not close to being a labor environmentalism as the way I'm constructing it. There's still these contradictions that exist. So at the end of the day, all I'm trying to get across here is that we need to, I think, push unions towards pushing the limit and pushing the envelope, but there's still these contradictions that we can't just be enamored with at the first instance. We have to look at them closely. Thank you very much.
Good. Excellent.